most recently, an intellectual biography of Julia Kristeva, which we'll hear about. So join me, please, in welcoming Alice Jardine.
Thank you, Tara. Well, thank you, everyone, and warm thanks to Kelly and Rebecca and everyone and Sarah for including me in this circle. I rarely anymore get to go to conferences where I feel that something important is happening. Most of the time, I just feel like there's a lot of chatting. And this time, it does feel very important, and I really am delighted and honored to be included. I also want to say, just in preface, that there are going to be some video clips that I'm going to be showing that are in French. And I'm not the kind of person who would assume that everyone in the room understands French. So I apologize for that. But on the other hand, I will always, in each case, give you the nugget, the heart of what's being said. Now, Kristeva. I assume that almost everybody, if not everyone in this room, has some basic semiotic notion of who we are referring to here, who we are circling around. We follow her, we read her, we listen to her, we teach her, we value her, I think. And one thing that helps us value her is that her image, both semiotic and otherwise, stays relatively stable over the years, even as time passes. I think you would all agree that we sort of, at least most of the time, believe that whatever is going on here, she's accepting the Holberg Prize, we have a sense of who we're talking about. Yet even this remarkable woman, who we presume to know, is absolutely the first person to say out loud that she has no idea who Julia Kristeva is. It was the very first thing that she said to me when we sat down to start what I now call my biography tapes. It was the very first thing she said. I don't know who this person is. And here's the way that she put it.
Je n'arrive pas à me reconnaître dans la demande qu'on m'adresse de parler de Julia Kristeva, parce que je ne sais pas trop bien qui est cette femme. Il y a une image, il y a une réception, il y a parfois même un culte. J'étais...
Sorry. My 18-year-old put my PowerPoint together, and I think she did a fabulous job, but occasionally. So I'll go back to that. Okay, so she acknowledges, and acknowledged with me up front, like, who is this woman, Julia Kristeva? People are always asking me things. They're asking me things about my work, about my life. I have no idea who this person is. She travels around the world accepting honors, speaking to huge audiences wherever she goes, and I can assure you, most often to her genuine astonishment. She knows, as a practicing psychoanalyst, that autobiography is what she calls a false genre, a faux genre, right? And on top of that, having been psychoanalyzed, she only believes in that what's left of her is a full, quote, transvaluation of self. Now, given all of that uncertainty, what about biography? What about someone else taking on the role of trying to know, of becoming a biography? Why should anybody else care if she doesn't? Why should anybody else care who Kristeva is? Why should I care? And who am I to care? Now, in her book, Risking Who One Is, my friend and colleague Susan Suleiman raises the question of how to operate critically as an intellectual when the work that one is interpreting has been produced by a contemporary, by a living artist, philosopher, critic, or writer with whom one feels a deep affinity. She unpacks through multiple examples how complex this question is in terms of identity, and I would add, especially in the beginning of the 21st century context of seriously competing identity models. For example, the model celebrating post-identity global cosmopolitan citizenship, which is the one Julia Kristeva would embrace, versus new models of authoritarian, often nationalistic, when not proto-fascistic reactions worldwide today against all forms of what she calls happy cosmopolitanism. For those of us politically and epistemologically engaged by many of the same urgent questions as the still living subject-object of our biographical or critical fascination, in the context of the world we're living in right now, the political piece of that world, and the relative silence of intellectuals confronted by those politics, the question of how to proceed with integrity can be paralyzing. And what about when one knows one's subject-object personally, maybe even likes that person, maybe even considers that person a friend? So on top of, or alongside the question of writing about one's contemporaries in the current global political climate, I've been lately asking myself many of the same questions that Suleiman asks about what she calls reading for autobiography, even when one doesn't mean to, about what she calls strong autobiographical reading. In this post-epistemological, political, and artistic situation today, what does it mean to engage in strong autobiographical reading practices in order to sort through the chaos of how to live, how to think, how to act, how to work? Does that kind of reading, as a search for the sense of one's own life and work, amount simply to intellectual narcissism at a moment when intellectuals need to perhaps adopt a more historically familiar, committed 1940s model of intellectual labor? Does the practice of strong autobiographical reading apply in the same way to critical and philosophical narrative as it does to fictional, poetic, or imagistic text? Must it most often work through either identification, I identify with this thinker, or critique, I disagree with this thinker, or can it involve both? What about writing biography through strong autobiographical reading? Would it be possible to do strong autobiographical reading through writing biography without resorting to analogy or allowing oneself to get in the way of the biographical project or even occupy all the space? I'm asking these questions obviously because I'm currently writing an intellectual biography of Kristeva, asking what constitutes her originality and her authority for the 21st century, with an emphasis on her call for an urgent revival of the humanities. There is no doubt in my mind, and I suspect in many of your minds, that Kristeva is one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th and 21st centuries. And yet I'm sure all of you know as well that her work is often marginalized, critiqued, or even maligned on the right and also on the left. I've never fully understood why, although sometimes I think I do. What I know for sure is that since I first started reading Kristeva in the mid-1970s, I have mostly remained fascinated by her loyal defense of the creative psychic process at the heart of the literary humanities, and her ability to maintain that defense across mind-numbing historical change. In 2014, do I still read Kristeva because of her defense, or is it because of my fascination with her status as a migrant female intellectual? Or is it her identity as a writer and as a mother? Or is it her advocacy for those who are marginalized in all kinds of scary new ways in an increasingly technologically flattened world? Or is it my attraction to risk, to the risk of thinking, to the idea of putting at risk my sense of who I am, while embracing Julia Kristeva's call for all of us to take the risk of thinking, period. Sometimes I wonder whether the strong resistance to Kristeva's thought, particularly on the Anglo-American left, is an allergy to thinking, period. Whatever the reason, the critiques are serious, they're loud, and often difficult to respond to. There is the familiar accusation of elitism, most often accompanied by an allusion to the famous difficulty of her prose, a stylistic approach associated with post-war high French post-structuralism and its emphasis on the power of language to shape reality. There's also the increasing, I think, accusations of ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism, the argument that her emphasis on caring for Europe, soigner l'Europe, that her emphasis on and celebration of the emphasis on singularities at the heart of European intellectual history, that these emphases have led her to naive ethnocentric tourism, something I read recently in an article. So naive ethnocentric intellectual tourism, particularly we've heard in China, and more importantly, have led her to false theoretical generalizations about the others that she claims to value. This leads to accusations, of course, that she isn't Marxist enough, or she's not post-colonial enough, or she's not feminist enough. And then, to add fuel to the fire, there is the often virulent critique of her persistent, unrelenting interest in religion and the history of religion and the history of mysticism at the heart of Judeo-Christianity. She has, after all, been called one of the most important theologians of the 20th century, as she has laid out the benefits of spirituality for a secularized world. There is also the sometimes hysterical complaint, I think, about her association with an intellectual camaraderie with a small gang of controversial French post-war male writers and thinkers. I'm sure many of you recognize Bernard-Henri Lévy, particularly those who, in the left's viewpoint, are not critiquing forcefully enough the current hegemonic power of advanced neoliberal capitalism. And then perhaps one of the louder complaints is her allegiance to psychoanalysis, with all of its 19th century echoes of the heteronormative bourgeoisie. Most recently, I couldn't believe the angry hullabaloo at Harvard about her psychoanalytic focus on male adolescence in the very paper that you guys have started to read that she sent. She focuses there on the adolescent's need to idealize, to believe in ideals, and how when those ideals are shattered, it can lead to nihilism, indeed to crisis, with Kristeva making reference not only to Western male adolescents, but also to young men of Middle Eastern heritage being pulled towards nihilistic extremism. You really would have thought by the reactions of the audience that she was saying that there are no reasons for international terrorism except teenage angst. But by far, the loudest, most frequent, longest, and snarky complaint about Kristeva, particularly on the part of feminists, is her long, passionate, loyal, very public love affair with Philippe Solers. And we know that it has been a long, long romance, and sometimes people want to talk about Philippe, and sometimes they don't. Here they are at the Ile de Ré as a young couple. Here they are recently in Paris at a conference I went to. And here's a little snippet from a movie that was done for French television that's on the Kristeva website, Solaires.
Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un coup de foudre? Un coup de foudre, c'est une expression très répandue. Il paraît que ça se passe de temps en temps.
Des nuages pleins d'électricité.
Il y a des attractions. Donc, mais alors, qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un coup de foudre qui dure? Là, c'est autre chose. Pour ça, c'est complexe. Il faut avoir affaire à des individus très complexes qui peuvent éventuellement se refoudroyer par moments.
Oui.
So I don't know how many folks in the room could follow that, but what is a coup de foudre? Sort of love at first sight, that electricity that happens when you fall in love. And what is a coup de foudre qui dure, that lasts a lifetime? What is that? How does that work? And you can tell by Kristeva's response that she's not quite sure what she thinks about this being on camera. Now, I have to ask myself, obviously, this question all the time, because I sort of had one of those for Kristeva when I was young, a coup de foudre, of the intellectual kind, at least, and it has endured. 62 years old. I still have it. It has endured. I remain fascinated by Kristeva's work in an unresolved kind of way. I made peace a long time ago with Colette and Beauvoir and Woolf and Atwood, upon whose texts I operated an obsessively strong autobiographical reading for decades. My fascination for Kristeva's work is different. I'm writing an intellectual biography of her, engaging in a strong autobiographical reading of her, putting myself at risk, in part because I want to be able to fully engage with the above-mentioned critiques of a body of work that I admire and find vitally important. But I'm also searching, when I'm most honest with myself, I'm searching for an etiology that is not an origin, but a start, a beginning to figuring out what it means to be an intellectual in the 21st century. Not an aesthete, not an aestheticist, not an expert, not a professor, but an intellectual, what Kristeva calls a contestatory intellectual. I try to be that. I haven't succeeded yet. It's really hard. Now, I first met Kristeva at Columbia. Many of you will recognize the campus of Columbia. When I was 24 years old, a young, naive woman from Ohio, doing my first year of graduate work at Columbia. I was a work-study student, and the then chair of French, Michael Rifater, asked me if I wanted to be Julia Kristeva's research assistant. I had no clue. I didn't know who that was. I just needed the money. The Kristeva that I met then and got to know, who was 10 years my senior, she still is, 10 years my senior, was mesmerizing to me instantaneously. I was particularly struck by the fact that even as a relatively young intellectual, she would be viciously attacked on the left by the Marxist graduate students. This is 1975. Marxist graduate students, and immediately be attacked by right-wing faculty without batting an eye. She didn't care. She didn't care. She was too busy devouring Mallarmé and writing her next book. Now, here she is about the way she looked about the time that I met her. This is a photo of her literally arriving in New York City, seeing it for the first time. And she doesn't look too much different there from a photo that's much more famous, I think, of her in Paris just a couple of years sooner than that. Now, there's all of that, but what I remember most acutely about Kristeva at that time was, on the one hand, her absolute brilliance, her intellectual brilliance, and on the other hand, her devotion to her baby son, David, born in 1975. I have an extremely vivid memory of young Kristeva holding David in one arm, one of those old telephones on her shoulder, in the other side, flipping through the books that I had just brought her from the library. David was and is at the center of Kristeva's life. And I don't know that you guys may, as Kristeva scholars and readers, you may know this, but I don't think the general public knows at all the extent to which David is at the center of her life. And over the years, I've stayed very attached to David, first babysitting him when he was very small, singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star 1,000 times, and just really sort of falling in love with him myself. And one of the things that mesmerized me was the way Kristeva looked at him. She's holding him up in the air here, smiling at him. And that was always very endearing to me. Now, over the years, it has never entered my head to ask Kristeva about David's developmental and cognitive delays. David is gorgeous, always just himself, just David, adored by both of his parents, who've done everything humanly possible to make space for his exquisite singularity. The family of David, his mom and dad, have done everything humanly possible to make space in this often difficult, cruel world for their son. Now, most recently, I spent some time at their home on the Ile de Ré with David, listening to now 39-year-old David recite La Rochefoucauld for the hours by heart. It was also there where I began to conduct the most serious portion of my interviews with Kristeva about her life. That was hard for me. It was a risk. I decided to take a risk. The risk of figuring out who Kristeva is for me through strong autobiographical reading. I decided to take seriously one of the most important things she has taught me and her work has taught me, the importance of the intimate, the importance of the intime. I am following my own desire to understand better how she connects her vie intime, her intimate life, with her thought processes that she makes public through constant writing. This is something I want to learn to do better. Now, I also want to engage those pesky critiques that I mentioned. Recently, Kristeva said in an interview with the Huffington Post, which I saw got picked up in her new version of this paper, she's now beginning to call herself a energetic pessimist, an energetic pessimist, which describes me exactly. I am the most energetic pessimist I know. And the world we're living in feeds that pessimism every day. So just for the record, this world we're living in needs Kristeva's strong ethical drive as a cosmopolitan, contestatory intellectual. It needs her insistence on thinking not about identity, but how to achieve and value singularity. I believe it needs her strong insistence on secularism and a new, renewed form of humanism, a transvaluation of classical religion with the infinite chain of being coming to us through books rather than through God. That's a Kristeva quote. It needs her valuing of the arts and of literature as unique forms of thought, as when she emphasized recently in China, quote, the only way to face up to totalitarian thought is to learn about and teach to new generations the value of the plurality of languages, literatures, and mentalities of the world, and how to both problematize and analyze them. The world needs her ability to embrace and indeed embody marginalization and vulnerability. It needs her insistence on the edges of subjectivity, from maternity through mysticism to mental illness and delinquency. For example, her recent work on disability as an opportunity. It's an opportunity. It's not a lack to be fixed through charity. It's not a deprivation, but an irreducible singularity. She reminded some of us in Boston recently that Jesus is the disabled God, carrying our mortality for us and our fear of mortality. I believe, finally, that the world really needs Kristeva's resistance to mediatization and mechanization, her pushing back against an increasingly digitalized, commodified technocracy at a time when the complex dance between what she calls the need to believe and the desire to know is being replaced by a kind of trudging obsession, which I know I get pulled into at times, about how one might still fit into the marketplace, where everything and everyone can be bought and sold, preferably in English. Kristeva has sutured my attention to her insistence on the importance of revolt, even small, localized, intimate revolt in the West, a continuous revolt against allowing our inner life, whether we call it psyche or whether we call it soul, to be colonized by media spectacle, capitalist consumption, and information overload. And I'm going to am emphasizing all of those things in this intellectual biography against her critics and for the sake of my own intellectual narrative. Now, there is a shape to this, and I want to insist upon the fact that at the heart of Kristeva's own strong thinking over the last 40 years or so, there is an intimately experiential shape that I'm trying to highlight. Kristeva arrived in Paris in 1965, very much the young girl educated in the Eastern Bloc, an immigrant. During the 1960s and 70s, she was at her most theoretical, developing her abstract vocabulary with breathless rapidity. While focused on gendered subjectivity, she was very careful to distance herself from feminism. When she focused on nationality, she looked to the United States or to China, not to Eastern Europe. Her own status as a mother was mostly hidden from public view, but for a handful of little texts. Any conceivable autobiographical voice there might have been at that point was buried under what you would all acknowledge, I think, to be some very heavy prose. Kristeva's work, published in the 80s and 90s, shifted radically and very quickly towards a more forthright consideration of what she saw as a series of very serious crises at the heart of Western civilization, a crisis brought on in large part by the assault of technology on human subjectivity. Since 2000, Kristeva has continued her call, begun in the 90s, for new, complex, flexible, hybrid subjectivities, and for the socio-political acceptance of otherness in Europe and around the world. But she left behind the abstract, scientifically theoretical prose of the first 2 decades of her work, as well as the predictive prose of the following 20 years, and has returned to her own experiential beginnings. She writes today more personally of foreignness, migration, and immigration. She explores more openly feminism, femininity, women, and motherhood. She questions world religions, atheism, and the current relationship to the sacred. She worries about the ends and the echoes of the Cold War and its effects on the formerly communist world, particularly Eastern Europe. She also acts publicly, as several of you have pointed out today, on behalf of the vulnerable. It is this return of Kristeva's work in the early 21st century to her own early life experiences that I have up to this point been exploring most deeply in the work I'm doing, while exploring for myself the shape of that experiential intellectual trajectory. Now, Kristeva would be the very first in line to say that one cannot be determined by one's childhood. And here's a clip of her talking about that.
Beaucoup de choses de mon enfance résonnent avec ce que je fais aujourd'hui. Mais si je suis freudienne, c'est parce que je crois, comme Freud, que on n'est pas déterminé par l'enfance, contrairement à ce qu'on pense du freudisme. il y a des germes de notre personnalité qui sont donnés par l'enfance, mais ce qu'on retrouve dans une analyse, c'est que l'enfance, on l'a reconstruite. Quelque chose nous est donné, mais nous l'avons refait. Et donc, on ne trouve jamais telle quelle la situation d'aujourd'hui dans le passé. Beaucoup de gens qui auraient cette idée sont déçus par l'analyse en disant « mais je ne trouve jamais le souvenir qui explique ce que je suis maintenant. La fine fleur, le fin mot, l'énigme. » Donc, c'est pour ça que je dis que les souvenirs ne sont pas des déterminations, ce sont des invitations à des voyages.
So we cannot, even in the psychoanalytic process, figure out who we are today and what's happening today through some kind of direct logic back to childhood. And I think most of us in this room as Kristeva readers would nod our heads in agreement with that. But taking her invitation to voyager, to travel seriously, I'd like to talk about Bulgaria for a minute, and I think there might be people here from Bulgaria, or at least one person, who I'm dying to meet because I want to make sure I get all of my history right. Kristeva, I'll say what I do know for sure. She was born in this little town called Sliven, which is sort of 2/3 to the right. And she was born 2 days after World War II became a really daily present reality for the people there, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. She was born on June 24th, 1941. Now, Sliven is at the foot of the Balkan Mountains and not far from the Black Sea, and some of you may have read some of her essays where she talks about that. She and her family would live in Sliven until they were able to relocate to Sofia after the war. Kristeva's parents could not but have felt that she was a glimpse of bright joy in the midst of the darkness of war. And one of the things that Kristeva has emphasized to me is that she was born into the chaos of war.
Il y avait une chanson qu'on chantait dans mon enfance, chanson russe qui dit donc c'était le 22 juin 41 à 20h je crois, on a bombardé Kiev et on a déclaré la Deuxième Guerre. Et donc, moi je suis née toute personne ne sait que je suis née 2 jours après, mais j'imagine parfois quand j'entends cette chanson, combien pour mes parents c'était quelque chose de dramatique. La Bulgarie entrait en guerre, très vite c'est la présence allemande qui va se manifester parce que la Bulgarie était l'allié des Allemands. Et avoir un enfant dans ces circonstances était à la fois sans doute une grande joie et en même temps une grande incertitude. Où va-t-on?
So it's important to remember, I think, that Bulgaria entered World War II in 1941 as a member of the Axis powers, but at the same time declined to participate in the extermination or deportation of Jews to concentration camps. And they refused, in fact, to even participate in Operation Barbarossa. It was the only Nazi-infiltrated country in Europe not to do the Nazis' bidding when it came to the Jews. As the war turned against Germany, Bulgaria did not move fast enough for the young Soviet Union's pleasure, and the Soviet Union declared war on Bulgaria, and there was an invaded Bulgaria in September of 1944, when she was 3 years old. The communist-dominated Fatherland Front took power. Bulgaria joined the Allies until the war ended. There were several left-wing uprisings. The most famous one is in September of 44. The monarchy was abolished. It wasn't until 1946, when she was 5, that a single-party People's Republic was established. Bulgaria became part of the Soviet sphere of influence under the leadership of Georgy Dimitrov, who I've decided next to Solers is one of the men who occupies the most imaginary space in the Kristevian brain, who laid the foundations for a Stalinist state, which was highly repressive, executing thousands of dissidents. So what I'm trying to get to here is that by the age of 5 years old, Kristeva's earliest childhood memories, earliest stories, earliest photos, earliest psychic imprints are infused by what she calls the great Bulgarian ambiguity. In this land beautiful land, where Greek myth, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam meet, kind of crash together, where first there were Nazi boots on the ground and then Soviet boots, where the monarchical government aligned itself with the Nazis but refused to export Jews, where Russians took over but only very slowly Stalinized themselves. This was the historical cauldron in which Julia Kristeva, whoever she is, was formed. Now, one of Kristeva's earliest memories is of her and her parents sneaking down to the basement in the house they were living in Sliven to listen to Radio London. She talks about this basement room where there was a window at the top of the basement wall where, either through stories or through memories, some kind of transvaluation of her recollection, she remembers first Nazi boots and then Stalinist boots marching past the window. Safety for this young child was in the basement, with family, with Europe. This is how she tells it.
Je me souviens seulement de deux choses. Dans cette maison que j'ai visitée avec le film, où je suis née, il y avait une cave.
A basement.
Et la maison était louée par des enseignants qui étaient probablement des communistes, des gens résistants. Et mes parents entraient dans la cave pour écouter Radio Londres. Et j'entends, pour qu'on n'entende pas, et pour que les Allemands, parce qu'il y avait des Allemands qui habitaient aussi, et qui passaient, etc. Et je me souviens, moi, je me semble avoir vu des soldats habillés en soldats allemands. Et j'entends le bruit de le signal de Radio Londres. Est-ce que je...
Dun, 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 dun. That voice, that sound, that voice of safety in the midst of utter destruction. How surprised should we be that very recently, something she's taken a lot of flack for, Kristeva said on television, politics, it's not for me. I prefer the micro-political, the microcosms of the macro-political world. Whether we feel empathy for that position or not, it shouldn't be surprising. When Kristeva evokes the Bulgaria of her childhood, as with many children, it's the intimacy of family that she remembers best. She was very, very lucky, surrounded by affection. And this is a little bit of her evoking this, I think, quite idealized Bulgarian childhood.
Quand je parle, je pense à la Bulgarie ou à Sofia, qui foisonne de souvenirs. Ces souvenirs, chaque fois quand je les évoque, n'ont rien de fixe ni de déterminant. Ce qui compte dans mon expérience du souvenir, c'est le voyage vers et à travers. C'est une perpétuelle interrogation.
I think this is really important. For her, it's always a voyage vers. It's traveling towards something. Her life is never static for her. Kristeva's father he lost his parents as a child. I think many people here know that. Her paternal grandfather died in the War of 1912, and her paternal grandmother died of grief shortly thereafter. Her father ended up being raised by a country peasant woman who also raised Kristeva, and until she was about 3 or 4. I'm still trying to figure out which. And Kristeva called her grandmother. Now, because her father was an orphan, he only had 2 choices in life at the time, a little bit like Julien Sorel in the Red and the Black. He could join the military, or he could become a priest. That was it. He decided to join the seminary, later studying at the theology faculty in Sofia. He was a practicing Orthodox Christian, but he also had a very restless, contestatory mind, and what he was most enthusiastic about was actually literature, especially French and Russian literature, and guess who? Especially Dostoevsky. He spoke many different languages. Russian was, of course, obligatory, and this was what he wanted for his daughter. He introduced Kristeva to literature and poetry from a very young age. The other thing he loved was music, and Kristeva remembers well his voice booming through the cathedral, although she then is very quick to point out that she did not inherit his musical talent, but rather that was passed on to her sister, who was born in 1945. Now, during the early part of the war, under Nazi occupation, Kristeva's father was part of the resistance there, and particularly the resistance to the deportation of Jews. He belonged to a very brave, I will say, brave group of intellectuals who went straight to the Tsar with their demands that the deportations not take place. At the end of the war, with the Russians in charge and the passage to communism, Kristeva's father left the seminary, and Kristeva took her last communion at the age of 5. Her father then, decided I'll study to be a doctor. That was until he found out that, as would take place later in Maoist China, he was going to have to go out into the countryside as a so-called barefoot doctor to supposedly treat the poor, with no medicine, no supplies, no help. So he quit medical studies, and in Sofia, he worked at the very, very Soviet-style Ministry of Religion, interpreting Christian orthodoxy for the young Soviet state. Kristeva describes herself as having been a real fille à papa. Her father adored her. He was a father in love, and the feeling was, as far as I can tell, mutual. She adored him. Kristeva's mother came from more of a bourgeois background, with Kristeva's maternal grandparents working in small business. I'm not going to talk much about her mother here, but one thing I think is very, very interesting about her goes back 2 generations into what Kristeva calls the religious polyphony of the Balkans. Because on her mother's side, one finds dissident Jews who eventually became Muslim, who eventually became Christian. And one might argue that in spite of this hybridized spirituality, Kristeva's mother was not religious at all. She was, in fact, adamantly secular. She was a scientist, had studied biology, and was a follower of Darwin. The young Kristeva was, in fact, caught almost every night in the middle of a good-humored but passionate debate at dinner of one kind or another, where her religious father was the dinosaur and her scientific Darwinian mother the, quote, progenitor of monkeys, which I love.
Et au niveau des libertés, mon père nous a amenés à communier dans le rite orthodoxe jusqu'à l'âge de 5-6 ans. Après, il ne voulait pas qu'on nous voit aller communier parce que les gens qui étaient religieux étaient réprimés. Et moi, j'ai très vite intégré, à partir de l'école, et maman aussi étant très laïque, même si elle ne disputait pas papa, mais on sentait qu'elle allait à l'église pour lui faire plaisir et elle ne croyait pas. Oui, ce que j'ai pas dit, c'est qu'elle a fait des études de biologie. Donc c'était le contraire de papa, et que à table, quand j'ai commencé à aller à l'école, on tournait en ridicule mon père et on disait qu'il était un dinosaure et que nous on descendait du singe, comme le disait Darwin, parce que maman était darwinienne. Et donc papa était furieux et il disait mais vous descendez du singe. aux dinosaures. Et il me disait, oui, oui, on voit bien, il suffit de vous voir pour savoir que vous descendez du sable.
So this was a constant conversation. So when you hear Kristeva say, it was last week or the week before, or talk about the conflict in the 21st century between science and religion, that's not coming from nowhere. And she implies, I think, these days that maybe we have more to learn from the dinosaurs than from the monkeys. Now, even with all of this going on, Kristeva was a very independent young girl in the young Soviet state. She remembers it as a time of having everything she needed, but nothing that she wanted. She tells the story of seeing, when she was about 5, a little girl next door being fed water, one spoonful at a time. This felt like the libidinal economy of communism. Spoonful by spoonful, drop by drop, one got what one needed. But only that. And she rebelled against that economy, preferring to run wild in her grandmother's flowers or among the beautiful Byzantine churches by the sea. These are very physical memories for her. And yet, she was very studious and a very good student. Now, you may know, because Kristeva's father was not a member of the Communist Party, Kristeva could not go to public school. She was disappointed not to be able to carry the Bulgarian flag, but she didn't cry about it. She almost never cried. Her parents enrolled her in the French maternelle school, where she was taught by French Dominican nuns. She absorbed languages, especially French, like a sponge. She memorized songs. She memorized Colette. She loved her nun teachers and was devastated when in the early 50s they were arrested, condemned as spies, and chased out of the country. Now, you all know that Kristeva has reflected a great deal on the fragility of the poetic imagination, and in particular on the importance of the French literary imagination. And I just want to emphasize that no matter what else was going on in her childhood, French literature was at the heart of her life. Now, like most excellent students, I think she's adorable there. She hates that photo. She longed for symbolic recognition. And so I'm just going to finish with some quick stories, 2 stories that she wants everyone to know, and 2 stories I want everyone to know about her Bulgarian childhood. Now, the 2 things she wants everybody to know. One is Bulgaria is the only country in the world that celebrates the alphabet. And those of you who've read her text on that know about that every spring. And she loved it. She loved having the alphabet literally on her chest. And she also wants everyone to know that Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist Party, the communist government in Bulgaria, the one who the Nazis accused of having set fire to the Reichstag, who was instrumental in stopping the Jews from being deported from Bulgaria. In fact, it was him who made it possible for Bulgarian Jews to get to Israel after the war. But what she wants you to really know is that that's not her giving him flowers, because she wasn't allowed to. Should have been her. She was first in her class, but she couldn't, of course, in part because of her father, and in part because every time she meets somebody famous, she gets sick, just like before meeting the Pope. Now, the 2 stories that I want you to know about, really, have to do first with Kristeva's hatred as a child of anything that smacked of girlish destiny. She spent a lot of time, I've chosen a short clip, talking about her huge, huge disappointment when somebody gave her a dollhouse.
Je parle le premier de langue, et je me souviens que j'ai eu, moi, un cadeau qui était comment on appelle ça, ça représente une maison où il y a la poupée, il y a la salle de bain, il y a la cuisine, il y a la salle à manger, etc. Et la petite fille qui doit s'occuper de tout ça. Et moi, j'étais très déçue parce que je ne voulais pas m'occuper de ça. Et mes poupées, je ne me suis jamais occupée beaucoup. J'en avais une, et elle est restée, pour ça qu'elle est encore vivante, parce que je ne jouais pas beaucoup avec elle. Elle est restée dans un tiroir. Et j'ai trouvé très ridicule que les petites filles poussent des poussettes. Et moi, j'avais des livres qui restaient dans un tiroir aussi, mais que j'utilisais et qui finissaient par être déchirés. Mais ce cadeau m'avait un peu déçue. Par contre, dans le lot là, de tout ce que la petite fille devait avoir, la cuisine, la salle de bain, etc., il y avait le bébé. Et le bébé, on pouvait l'asseoir pour le baigner. Il y avait un trou au niveau des fesses pour pouvoir l'asseoir. Et moi, je trouvais ça absolument stupide. Mais en même temps, ce qui m'intéressait, c'est de voir ce qu'il y a à l'intérieur. Et ma mère m'a dit, mais tu seras médecin. Et c'est vrai que pendant très longtemps, je voulais être médecin.
So she hated baby carriages and dollhouses and all that stuff, but she loved those little figurines. But what she loved about them was they had these holes, in their bottoms that made them, you could sit them down. And she loved opening up the baby dolls to see what was inside. Okay, so the other story, whatever you do with that is fine. The other story I want you to know is that Kristeva as a child never cried. She basically never cried. She would get disappointed. She was disappointed she couldn't carry the Bulgarian flag because her father was not a member of the Communist Party. She hated the dollhouse. But she never cried, and her sort of stay calm and carry on posture became integral to her character. This became clear to me during what I now call the running story, which I might skip because I want to finish. Kristeva as a child never walked. She ran. And if I showed you the clip, you'd see that at that point I break out laughing hysterically because I think it's funny. She tells the story of running and running and running. She'd break away from her mom and she'd run as fast as she could until she fell down and either bruised or got bloody or something. And her mom would come running to help her with tears and worried. And she would say, Kristeva would say, "Oh, Mama, don't worry. I will take care of you." Now, very recently, Kristeva has reflected publicly on the fact that she takes care of herself by taking care of others. For high school, Kristeva attended the Alliance Française, where she continued her linguistic and literary studies. She took up journalism, and I don't know how many of you know that she was quite a professional journalist before she left Bulgaria. She got paid enough as a professional journalist to become financially independent. And that was the moment that was the turning point for her and for the rest of us, because it was the age of Sputnik. As you probably know, time to make big decisions for her about her future. She was a genius at math and science and decided she would become an astrophysicist, go off to Siberia in the Soviet Union to study and probably help develop Cold War weapons. She applied for the fellowship, which she clearly should have won, but of course her father was not a member of the Communist Party, so she didn't get it. And what she didn't know was that just a few days later, the French government would offer her a scholarship to go to Paris to study the human sciences. At the bad news, her father cried and cried for days, but she didn't. She didn't cry, and the rest we know. Now, in final conclusion, I want to say that Kristeva has often reflected on the fact that she never plans her life. She's never had a program, she's never had a strategy, she never thought about leaving Bulgaria before she actually left. She never thought, I will go to France and become a famous theoretician. She talks about swimming through life, traveling through herself. Je me voyage. She swims through experience. She doesn't add her experiences to a list. For her, what is important is to move along in life and writing, pulled by what she calls pure curiosity. And I'm going to jump one more here just because I want to have time for questions. But I think it's really, really important to understand that she doesn't, so many people ask, how does she write so much? How does she do that? She teaches at Jussieu. She's a practicing psychoanalyst. She has a family. She's raising a disabled child. What is going on? Well, she doesn't plan it. She just moves through it. And she talks about how she tries to construct herself as she swims through what she calls the waves of history. Now, at this point, my attention to the question of reading for strong autobiography or reading autobiographically in strong ways really perks up, because that's the way I've lived as well, with much less successful and illustrious results. But it's the same lack of plan. And so I end with the question of what can I today learn from my contemporary, my friend who's 72, right now about how to live, how to work, how to be, how to contest. One thing I already know is that over the past few years, Kristeva and I have both come to share a deep concern about the world of our children and the world of our students, where everything is becoming so programmed that it's very hard to be present to oneself. Young people, she would argue, are becoming so rapidly commodified and mechanized that vulnerability of any kind is not allowed, or certainly not publicly. And this one I am going to play because I think it's really important.
L'humanité est tellement prise dans une course effrénée, un soi-disant bonheur qui est un bien-être avec tous les guillemets de jouissance, performance, brillance, que toute vulnérabilité est considérée comme une menace insupportable et impensable. Donc il y a une vision de l'humain qui est mercantilisée
et machinique. So she says humanity is running, racing towards not following curiosity, but racing towards some goal that one has been told one should have. And this kind of programming, she argues, runs totally countercurrent to the self-making that she's advocating, that's based on curiosity and ethical passion. Now, to make things even more complicated, she absolutely does not believe in destiny, and it's a wonderful quote, but it complicates things because she doesn't plan, she moves through the waves of history and thoughts, she is pulled by curiosity and not much more because there is no destiny. So whoever history decides that Julia Kristeva ultimately might be, can everyone in this room imagine embracing the fact that someone so accomplished, that someone so cosmopolitan, such a contestatory intellectual, could be and always have been living life so in the moment, so caught up in waves of curiosity? And how can that utter lack of strategy help her autobiographically inclined biographer to find her way forward with some integrity? Kristeva often quotes the words on Colette's tombstone, some of you may know, "Renaître n'a jamais été au-delà de mes forces." To be reborn has never been beyond my capacity. Having now done some strong autobiographical reading of Kristeva, perhaps it's time for me, or for all of us, to contemplate some rebirth, or at least some re-self-invention, taking on the challenge of strong thinking, traveling through oneself, constructing oneself, walking the tightrope between intellect and revolt, between the intimate and the public, between work and play, with no plan, no program, no strategy, no directive. That's the kind of contestatory intellectual I want to be henceforth for whatever time I have left on this earth. And you, I think it's worth the risk. Do you? Thank you.